So before we dig into the report, I would just like to do some scene setting and say a few words on the IEA for those who may not be familiar with our institution. The IEA has been created in 1974 after the first oil crisis. It's an intergovernmental organization that aims at facilitating the coordination of energy policies of its member countries and also beyond. Its initial mandate was to ensure the security of energy supply, mainly oil in the beginning, in order to support economic growth. Since the past 50 years, the IEA has expanded its expertise to all energy sources. We collect data and do analysis on almost all countries of the world. We look at all energy sector and all technologies. For Africa, we work extensively with AFREC, for example, but we also work with local governments and ministries. At the IEA, we have around 300 statisticians, analysts, modelers, and experts that work on energy. And the IEA can ensure policy advice to its members and also beyond. At the IEA, we convey policy advice to policymakers, and we also organize high-level summits. We also work extensively on climate issues and clean energy transition, especially this year of the COP26 that was held this month. Throughout our regular training activities, we work closely with many countries to help them improve their data collection and build models. Also, with the support of the European Union, the IEA is implementing a capacity reinforcement program for 10 sub-Saharan countries. And in this program, for the moment, we are doing only online courses for each country, but we also have several other activities such as the IEA Africa University, and we do bilateral work with the countries on different topics. We are hoping to start doing in-country training activities as soon as the situation allows us next year. Last but not least, if you would like to be kept informed of our activities, then do not hesitate to join our WhatsApp group and LinkedIn community if you have not yet done so. So let's now look at this famous report. The WEO, it's the energy world's most authoritative sources of analysis and projections. This flagship publication of the IEA has appeared every year since 1998. And its objective data and dispassionate analysis provide critical insights into global energy supply and demand in different scenarios and the implications for energy security, climate targets, and economic development. The WEO is usually published in November. However, for the second year in a row, the IEA has released our flagship report a month early in October. We did it last year because of the exceptional year defined by the COVID-19 crisis. And this year, it was also another exceptional year because of the COP26 climate change conference meeting in Glasgow. Also, this year, the WEO report is freely available on the IEA website for download. So the way we will do this presentation is that first I will present on the context and on the climate targets, and then Arno will take over with the rest of the presentation, and then we will be joined later by Martin Coopers, who is a WEO energy modeler, and we will then be able to answer all your questions. So at a time when policymakers are contending with the impacts of both climate change and volatile energy markets, the WEO 2021 has been designed as a handbook for the COP26 meeting, and it offers a critical opportunity to accelerate climate change and the clean energy transition. The IEA work this year has demonstrated the IEA's commitment to leading clean energy transitions globally, but enabling governments to understand what they need to do to put emissions into rapid and sustained decline. But we have also made very clear to countries transitions to have to be secured, affordable, and fair for all citizens. If governments do not ensure that these key elements are at the core of their policy making for the transformation of their energy sectors, then they risk failure. At the time of the publication of this year's WEO, governments are getting an advance warning of this risk, with the prices of natural gas, coal, and electricity rising to an all-time high in many regions. The key reasons for these sharp increases in energy prices are not related to efforts to transition to clean energy. They include a rapid economic rebound from last year's pandemic-induced recession, weather-related factors, and some planned and unplanned outages on the supply side. Weather-related factors such as droughts are having large implications for the energy sector. Extreme weather events over the past year have highlighted the risk of unchecked climate change, and the energy sector will feel the impact. Today, the world's energy infrastructure is already facing increasing physical risk related to climate change, which emphasizes the urgent need to enhance the resilience of the energy system. We estimate that around 1/4 of global electricity networks currently face a high risk of destructive cyclone winds, while over 10% of dispatchable generation fleets and coastal refineries are prone to severe coastal flooding, and 1/3 of freshwater cooled thermal power plants are located in areas of high water stress. Also, a failure to accelerate clean energy transitions would continue to leave people exposed to air pollution. Today, 90% of the world's population breathe polluted air, leading to over 5 million premature deaths a year. So there are unmistakable signs of change. In 2020, even as economies sank under the weight of COVID-19 lockdowns, additions of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar PV increased at their fastest rate in 2 decades, and electric vehicle sales set new records. A new energy economy is coming into view, ushered forward by policy action, technology innovation, and the increasing urgency of the need to tackle climate change. There is no guarantee that the emergence of this new energy economy will be smooth, and it is not coming forward quickly enough to avoid severe impacts from climate change. But it is already clear that tomorrow's energy economy promises to be quite different from the one we have today. Many developing economies are still in the midst of a profound public health crisis with COVID-19. Progress towards universal energy access has stalled, and many governments face persistent challenges in mobilizing investment in the energy infrastructure that is vital to support social and economic development. So the essence of this year's WEO is a detailed stockpile of how far countries have come in their clean energy transitions, how far they still have to go to reach the goal of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and what actions governments and others can take to seize opportunities along the way. Let us now look at emissions. Over the last 20 years, global CO2 emissions have risen substantially. Although in the 2010s showed signs of an uncertain plateau, cumulative emissions since pre-industrial emissions have warmed the Earth by more than 1 degree. Looking back at our baseline before the Paris Climate Summit, we saw continued emissions growth to 2050. This would have led to a catastrophic level of warming of around 3.5 degrees in 2100. According to the IPCC, era 6 under 3.5 degrees of warming, devastating heat waves would occur almost 5 times more frequently than they do today, almost once in every 2 years. Not only would they occur more frequently, but they would also be more intense, with the maximum heat wave temperatures almost 4 degrees hotter. Extreme precipitation events potentially leading to catastrophic flooding would be twice as frequent and 20% more intense than they are today. This would truly be an unlivable Earth. But we now see a very different picture emerging in the energy sector, thanks to new policies, technology cost reductions, and also the economic impact of the pandemic. Our stated policies scenario, which includes all the latest legislated policies and regulatory targets, but not announced net zero pledges or updated NDCs, in the steps, we see a near-term peak in global emissions in 2026, and after that, a slow decline. This has allowed us to reduce by almost 1 degree our projections of 2100 warming from 3.5 degrees Celsius to 2.6 degrees Celsius. But this is still well above the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, and this would risk catastrophic climate change. In just 30 years, by 2050, the projected level of warming in the steppes would mean that deadly heat waves would be twice as frequent as they are today. So even though we should be pleased at the progress made since Paris, we need to be realistic. Without substantially scaled up ambitions, we still face an acceptable risk. In the last year or so, countries accounting for up to 70% of global emissions have announced net zero targets. Around 120 countries have submitted new or updated 2030 NDCs, and these account for slightly more than half of global emissions. These new policy ambitions and net zero pledges have been incorporated into the new scenario called Announced Pledges Scenario, which we analyze in detail for the first time in this year's wheel. If these are implemented in full, then this would lead to a substantial change in the emissions pathway compared to the steps. Emissions would peak in the mid-2020s and then enter in a steady decline. By 2050, they would be about 40% below current levels. For 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, global fossil fuel CO2 emissions have always grown every decade. If announced pledges are fully implemented, then 2030 would mark the first time since the Industrial Revolution that fossil fuel emissions ended the decade lower than they started. And this is despite the huge downward shock of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. This would put the world within striking distance of the temperature goal of limiting warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And by the time that the WEO was being published in mid-October, more than 120 countries had announced new targets for emissions reduction by 2030, and government representing about 70% of global CO2 emissions had pledged to bring those emissions to net zero by 2050 or soon after. So since mid-2020, we have more countries who have been raising their ambitions. The announcements have not been limited to CO2 emissions, with more than 100 countries promising to also cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And our updated analysis of all these new targets on top of all those made previously shows that if they are met in full and on time, they would be enough to hold the rise of global emissions to 1.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This is a landmark moment, as it is the first time that governments have come forward with targets of sufficient ambition to hold global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So we are left with an ambition gap of around 14 gigaton in 2030, which needs to be closed to put the world on the net zero emissions pathway. But the good news is that we have the policies and technologies to close the gap, and a substantial share of the necessary emissions reduction come from cost-effective and well-understood technology measures. Our country-by-country and sector-by-sector analysis shows that over 40% of the 2030 ambition gap between the announced policy scenario and the net zero emission scenario could be closed with cost-effective technology measures, provided that policymakers put in place the right enabling conditions. We estimate that 60% of the additional generation of wind and solar required to close the gap in the electricity sector could be achieved cost effectively. In this case, solar PV and wind additions would reach 800 gigawatt in 2030, up from 470 gigawatt in the announced policy scenario and 248 gigawatt in 2020. More than half of a gigaton of additional reductions could be achieved through other cost-effective measures in the power sector, in particular hydropower expansion in emerging economies and developing economies. Nuclear market power is also a part of the cost-effective measures in certain cases, notably nuclear lifetime extension in advanced economies where acceptable and with independent safety checks, new nuclear, as well as select markets where projects can be delivered by established industries on time and on budget. Also, reducing fossil fuel methane leaks is another critical measure. About 1.7 gigaton of CO2 equivalent could be reduced cost effectively through measures that are technically relatively well understood. Energy efficiency provides also large opportunities to reduce emissions cost effectively. We estimate that end-use efficiency could provide another 1 gigaton of cost-effective reductions through the strengthening of fuel economy standards, particularly in trucks and appliance performance standards and industrial energy efficiency. But what about the other 60% reduction? About 25% of this is from measures that reduce demand in addition to the energy efficiency savings already spoken about. Particularly important among these measures, it's the role of materials efficiency in the industry sector, and achieving this requires both organizational and technology changes on the part of both producers and consumers, but much of this potential is likely to be cost effective. Another 15% could be seen as investment in bringing down, for example, the cost of technologies such as hydrogen, advanced batteries, CCUS, and advanced biofuels. The bulk of all these measures are not cost effective by 2030, but by enhancing near-term deployment, we can spur innovation and accelerate the deployment of enabling infrastructure. This can allow these technologies to play a much larger role in the long term after 2030. So deploying the clean energy technologies required to bridge the gap between the announced pledges scenario and the net zero emission scenario requires a substantial scale up in clean energy investment. Over the last few years, roughly $1 trillion has been invested in clean energy technologies annually, and this amount has been relatively stable. This clean energy investment has been roughly evenly split between advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies. This is despite the fact that emerging market and developing economies account for around 60% of world energy demand. So relative to their share in world demand, we are already seeing a shortfall of clean energy investment in these economies. In the announced pledges scenario, global clean energy investment more than doubles to more than $2 trillion by 2030. However, the split becomes more skewed towards advanced economies, with this group making up more than 55% of clean energy investment in 2030, but only 1/3 of world energy demand. Part of this is due to the fact that most advanced economies have net zero pledges, which drive an upsurge of clean energy investment. So the risk of a two-speed transition is very real in this scenario. To reach the net zero pathway, the world needs to invest almost double the amount seen in announced pledges scenario, with investment in clean energy rising to almost $4 trillion. But 70% of the increase in between the two scenarios comes in emerging markets and developing economies. In the net zero emission scenario, these economies make up almost 60% of clean energy investment, far more reflective of their 2/3 share in world energy demand. Most of this clean energy investment needs to come from the private sector, but an international catalyst is essential to accelerate flows of capital in support of energy transition and allow developing economies to chart a new lower emission pathway for development. Now, to conclude my part of this presentation, I'd like to take a step back to explore the impacts of the policies we have mentioned, the technology shifts, the efficiency improvements, and other measures. Which path the world follows and which set of policies and measures are adopted will have drastic implications on energy markets and the speed of the emergence of the new energy economy. If we go ahead with only policies announced and engraved in laws, in the stated policy scenario, energy demands continues to grow, with the next decade looking much like the past decade. The stubbornness of the statu quo is what we would be experiencing, and the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix declines only slightly from 79% today to 75% in 2030. In the stated policy scenario, global oil demand exceeds 2019 levels by 2023 and reaches 103 million barrels per day in 2030. Natural gas is around 15% higher in 2030 compared to 2020, and coal demands remains well above 5,000 million tons, while output from solar PV and wind triple over the next decade, with growth in over 130 countries, meeting 3/4 of global electricity demand growth. However, announced pledges do change the picture for global energy markets, and by 2030, the share of unabated fossil fuels declines to 72% of global energy mix. In the announced policy scenario, oil demand, announced pledges scenario, oil demand rebounds in the next couple of years, but peaks by 2025, then flattens. Most of this change is driven by trends of oil use for cars, and which would be over 2 million barrels per day lower in the announced pledges scenario than in the steps. Also, EV sales increase a lot, and as specific measures to achieve net zero pledges are implemented and backed by specific policies, especially within the 34 countries that have set up policies or targets to stop new sales of ICE vehicles by a certain date. So thanks to all these policies and the resultant growth of EV sales, oil demand for road transport goes into structural decline from now on and bring global oil demand to a peak. In the APS, natural gas demand reaches its maximum level soon after 2025 and flattens. Most of this change in trend stems from the power sector, where gas demand ends 42 BCM lower than in 2020. In countries with net zero targets, natural gas loses market shares with the growing role of solar PV and wind. The building sector also sees gas demand in 2030 lower than in 2020, with the introduction of strict performance standards for existing and new buildings and increasing electrification of building heating. Coal demand is also almost 10% lower than today by the end of the decade in the APS. The picture for energy market is drastically different in an NZE world. Already by 2030, oil demand falls to close to 70 million barrels per day, more than 30 million barrels per day below the steps. Propelled down by rapid electrification of transport, gas demand also continues to increase in the coming years because of the coal to gas switch when possible. But in the second half of the decade, gas demands falls drastically as well. So the changes in the NZE are most extreme for coal, with demand in 2030 around 55% lower than today, with demand in the power sector dropping by 2/3. So meeting growing demand for electricity while simultaneously phasing out fossil fuels fired generation requires a quadrupling of solar PV and wind deployment relative to today. And wind and solar PV, they also provide as much as 40% of electricity generation globally in 2030. So the scale of the changes required in the energy system are immense, but we have reason to remain optimistic. The pathway limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, it's narrow, but it is achievable. And in the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of announcements, lots of pledges. Now let's walk the talk and enter a decade of action, implementing policies to meet announced pledges and raising ambition in line with the NZE target, and we don't have time to waste. So now I pass the floor to my colleague Arnaud, who will continue the presentation and discuss electricity sector now. Arnaud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zakia. Can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Just before I start, I just want to emphasize that indeed this latest World Energy Outlook report discusses a lot on climate. It was designed as a tool for COP26. We discuss a lot of those net zero scenario. I just wanted to make 2 points. Number one is that all those global trajectories will impact a lot Africa because it relates to demand for energy resources Africa might be able to supply because it will influence a lot on the investment trends in the energy. And number 2 point is that these net zero pledges and this decarbonization pathway are also driven by African countries. So we have South Africa, who already committed to be net zero by 2050. Nigeria made an impressive pledge at the COP to be net zero by 2060. We have Rwanda too. So a number of African countries are also taking this pathway. So this is why we really want to explore more implications and ways of having these energy transitions in Africa. This publication is not so much focused on Africa, but we'll have a forthcoming report that really looks at the continent trends. So that being said, I'll cover a bit some trends at the global level on electricity, investment, energy security, and then I will just share some findings on Africa. So the first point I wanted to discuss with you is electricity, because we are witnessing profound transformation on how electricity is produced globally. So in the year 2020, we have seen renewables as the only source of power to grow, whereas all the other sources were reducing. However, fossil fuels still make 60% of electricity generation, with coal-fired power plants being alone a very important source of power. We have nuclear power that provides 10% of global energy generation at global level. And if we look forward, we really expect renewables to become the foundation of the new electricity systems. So looking by 2030, under the announced pledge scenario, we would expect the expansion of renewables, including wind and solar, to really keep pace with the increase of electricity demand growth, because we are expecting more demand for electricity due to economic growth, due to electrification of heating, due to electrification of transport, due to the rise of middle income class consuming more appliances and which are eager for more electricity consumption, and also from the beginning of hydrogen being produced with electrolyzer. So in this scenario, we would expect the share of renewables to reach 50% in 2030. And solar PV and wind would really lead the way, because they are the cheapest source of electricity in most countries. If we look at the more ambitious scenario, which is the net zero by 2050, we see that it's even faster. Electricity demand is increasing more, and renewables triples by 2030. So in other words, it means that for solar PV and wind, we need the size of the industry to quadruple over the next decade to more than 1,000 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. Quadrupling might sound very big, but this is actually what happened over the past decade. So it's just a growth which is as important as what happened in the past decade. A few words on coal, because coal-fired plants alone account for 30% of the energy-related global emissions of CO2. So really, if we want to address our climate issue, we need to look very closely at coal. And there are two streams. First is the existing fleet of coal plants, and there are 9,000 coal plants in operation in more than 100 countries. So there are many questions on phasing down, repurposing, reducing their use or retrofitting. And the number two question is on potential new coal plants under construction. And here we have heard very important announcements before COP and at COP, with China pledging to stop building new coal plants abroad, so stop financing coal plants, and instead we know that there are many other options for baseload power which are less emitting in terms of CO2. So if we move to one key topic which is related to electricity, it's grids, because we often discuss generation, so new plants, but actually grids are the backbone of electricity system, and they are fundamental to supporting clean energy transitions, to supporting energy access in Africa and other places, and to support energy security. So basically, we observe, based on experience, that grid infrastructure require a 10 years lead time on average to get all the necessary approval process. So it's very important to plan carefully all projects related to grid. And today, investments in grids are around 300 billion USD on average. And this is for transmission, distribution, interconnections, new lines, but also for modernizing and digitalizing existing grids. And looking ahead, we expect this level of investment to triple by 2030 in the net zero scenario and to remain very elevated. And the reason for that is that we will have higher electricity demand. We will also have more renewables, and connecting and effectively integrating those dispatched renewable sources requires more cables, requires more grids. And also, of course, we have some aging infrastructure that we need to modernize, that we need to replace. And so this requires really coordination and advanced planning for policymakers, regulators, system operators. Another point that we are analyzing, and which relates to energy security, is on the increasing integration of variable renewables in power systems. So this is a bit technical, but I'll go very quickly on that. If you look at the left, you can see electricity demand hour per hour over 2 days, so 48 hours. So during the night, electricity demand decreases, and then it goes up again during the day, and there is a top, which is maximum, which is reached at the evening. So this is how most countries have their electricity demand evolve hour after hour. And you may know that for electricity, we need to have a perfect match between supply and demand. So when looking at supply, and let's see how we increasingly integrate renewables, including wind and solar PV. So wind sources are variable, but they are more or less stable over time, whereas solar PV generates electricity during the day, of course. So the thing is that when you add more of wind and solar PV, that's a very good source of power to meet some of your demand, for example, during the day. But when it's the evening and your solar PV plants are no more producing because there is no more sun, but demand is increasing, you have a need to match and very quickly turn on the other dispatchable power plants. And what we see is that with an increasing integration of variable renewables, there will be needs for more solutions of flexibility to ensure that when we have excess in the production of electricity from wind and solar PV, maybe we store that additional electricity, and when we have the peak demand at the evening, we have solutions to very quickly match the demand. And the IEA has been analyzing with very much details all those different steps of having more and more variable renewables and providing some ideas to policymakers to make that integration working well, because this requires advanced planning. And this is true for Europe, but also we do the same for China, who is aiming to develop a lot solar PV. So there will be increasingly questions on how to deal with variability. So now I'd like to move to more coming back to the investment numbers, but looking at what Zakia presented as a global new energy economy which is emerging. So as wind and solar PV will increase, and we also expect new technologies to come on board. And of course, we know that this transformation of the energy sector is very much motivated by the fight against climate change, but there are also huge commercial, industrial, and employment gains under this new global economy. And if we look at cumulative market opportunities, we think that companies which are manufacturing wind turbines, solar panel, lithium-ion batteries, electrolyzers, and fuel cell will be on market that will dramatically increase. And these 5 equipments markets by the end of by the year 2050 would have a comparable size of what is oil markets today. So in other words, there will be as much money to be made for those new technologies in 2050 as what is being made by jobs today. And if we look at by oil today, sorry, if we look at jobs, we also estimate that there are much more jobs to be created in this net zero scenario under those new clean energy technologies than the jobs that will be lost in declining sectors such as coal. Still, there are very difficult questions to be addressed on ensuring just transition, and the IEA is really working a lot on people-centered transition to help countries see how jobs lost in the coal sector, for example, can be offset, or how governments can deal with those employment issues and look more at the opportunities than at the threats on those sectors. Another way of looking at what we just mentioned is looking at the trade of the energy sector. Again, today, trade of energy commodities is largely dominated by oil. We expect that to change and to have new kids in the block with critical minerals, with hydrogen, and we expect oil to be increasingly traded, not so much from European Union and China as it is today, because European Union and China would cut their consumption and imports, but to shift more to the Middle East, to developing countries, Asia and Africa. And there are indeed many opportunities for Africa as well, especially when we look at critical minerals. In our net zero scenario by 2050, we see critical minerals being half of the value of trade, and this is for lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, as well as copper, which is all very required in the power systems and in the clean energy technologies. I'll move directly to two slides which relate more to Africa. So the implications of those transition and what transformation we are observing as of today in the energy system are not the same everywhere, of course. And when we look at developing countries, there is still a huge challenge around access to electricity, with 770 million people without access and 2.5 billion people without access to clean cooking. A large majority of those persons are located in sub-Saharan Africa, especially for access to electricity. And our numbers show that COVID-19 reversed the progress that were observed in access. Reaching universal access is the first priority for energy transitions in many countries, including in Africa. And this is central to the scenario that IEA is designing, especially the net zero scenario. So we really see universal access to electricity and clean cooking to be one of the first milestones to be reached in a longer term pathway to net zero by mid-century. And this requires investment to scale up, to increase by 4.5 times by the end of the decade. And this level of investment is not unrealistic. It's just 2% of today's annual energy investment, but that would really change lives of a third of the world's population. And one last point we are also tracking is that for people in EMD, so emerging and developing economies, their exposure to dangerous level of air pollution, particulate matters, is 40 times higher than those for people living in advanced economies. So by 2030, under current trends, we expect 3 million premature deaths due to bad ambient air quality. This relates to the use of traditional biomass for clean cooking, for example, and to other sources of pollution. And so this also can be addressed with bold measures and in a full access net zero trajectory. Again, investments need to scale up under those climate-driven scenario. And if we look at how this should be split between North Africa, South Africa, and the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, we see that there is need for more than doubling the level of investment in most technologies. So this also includes fossil fuel related investments, but also more and increasingly clean energy transition fuels. Sorry, I will stop here so that we keep a bit of time for question, and we are very, very happy to have Martin who joined us. Maybe I will lead the bullet points of the conclusion so that you can check them while you use the Q&A box, or you raise your hand for any question, since we have Martin who directly contributed to the modeling and the analytical work of this book. So now the floor is really yours. So you can use the Q&A box or raise your hand if you have any question for us. In the meantime, Martin, I don't know if you want maybe to just introduce yourself and just say the specific areas you've been working on under this report.
Sure. Thanks, Arno, and welcome everybody. I am part of the WEO modeling team. So specifically, I work on the end-use demands in our model, and even more specifically on industry demand. So everything which is related to heavy industry, for example, the iron and steel industry, cement industry, I am responsible for in all regions and to model the trajectories in our different scenarios.
Thank you, Martin. I see we have one question on the chat. Okay, I can come back to this slide. I think it relates to the cost-effective actions to reduce emissions. And the question is about the role of concentrated solar power and hydro, as there are some interesting developments, especially in African nations. Maybe I can start, and Zakia, if you want to jump on that one. I would say that our modeling exercise looks at all technologies, all sources of power, and indeed we see a very sharp increase in all renewables, but more specifically on wind and solar PV. Maybe our numbers are really at global level, so I would expect that the CSP projects and hydropower projects, which are very dynamic and very weighting very much in Africa, are not that much reflected when merged at the global level. There are a number of hydropower developments in all regions, but maybe Africa is one of the most dynamic for that. And the first development in the power sector we saw globally relates more to solar PV and to wind.
Then I see a question: what methodologies are implemented in load forecasting? That's a very good question. Our approach here is really to go from the end use demands. So where we start is in each sector, for example, as I said, for the heavy industry, we see how the economic development is, how the construction of buildings and everything is, which has an impact on industrial production as well. So we go really from the economic development, we project the economic development, and then we look at political targets to increase electrification or to use substitute fuels. And this, from this economic perspective and then the fuel perspective, we end up in our load forecast. So it's an approach driven from the end users of the energy, and these end users and the economic and fuel projection of the end users delivers us, for example, in the end, the electrical load. For example, if countries have targets on electric vehicles, that will certainly increase our electric demand in these countries compared to normal combustion engine vehicles.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the explanation on the methodology. I see one question specific to the circular carbon economy, which was undertaken by Saudi Arabia. I am honestly not knowledgeable enough on this oil and gas topic. What I can just say is that we are very closely looking at all the initiatives, and there are an increasing number of announcements from oil producing economies coming from the Gulf, so including Saudi Arabia, but also the United Emirates. Again, I was mentioning Nigeria, which is quite an oil-based economy and country, a very oil-rich country, who made a recent pledge to be net zero by 2060. So those political level pledges on climate and energy will need to be translated into more concrete policies, and yes, circular economy is one of the answers. That being said, we can definitely pass the question to colleagues, and I don't know, Martin, if you know more on this one, or Zakia, please feel free to jump.
No.
And if not, we have someone who raised the hand, so we can take another question live.
Hello. Hello, Arno. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, Zakia, thank you for the presentation, Arno and Martin. I enjoyed the presentation.
So I see we have Israel Jackson who raised the hand. Israel, if you shall be able to unmute and to ask your question.
Yes, I have. I'm just about asking the question now. If you can hear me.
We would be very pleased to hear from you.
That's all right. So you did mention something about critical minerals, and my concern is that, do you include the possibility of the critical minerals being exhaustible in your projections of the technology developments that will be required for this renewable for transition? Because I am thinking this way, that these resources are, the critical minerals are exhaustible, and the projections for the technology developments that will be required to meet the carbon emissions reduction is on the high side. So do you see the possibility of these critical minerals limiting achievement of these your projections?
Thank you for the question, and sorry for speaking over you. I was not hearing. So the IEA released a special report on critical minerals a couple of months ago, which really enters much more into details. What I can say from this report is that we do not anticipate shortage of the available resources to be able to support the clean energy transitions, meaning that there is enough copper, there is enough silver, minerals, cobalt, lithium, that to match our needs to increase the level of grids, of wind turbines, of batteries. Then there are questions on how to carefully plan the increase in production. And the report comes with a number of recommendations. One of them is to ensure that countries develop some geological exploration survey to find new resources, and of course to put the right conditions to produce them in a sustainable way, because we know that mining is a very challenging sector when it comes to environment and to social impacts. Another area which is explored in the report is the potential for recycling. And actually, when it comes to batteries, there are a lot of minerals that can be recycled, and this can reduce a bit demand. But to answer your question, we don't see supply or availability of the resource to be an obstacle to the development of clean energy transition. But this topic needs to be increasingly and carefully taken into consideration by policymakers and plans.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the second question I have is with respect to investments required for achievement of the targets, especially for developing countries like Nigeria, where funding has been a major problem. I do not know, or maybe if you can give us insight as to whether there are funding opportunities that could be leveraged upon to increase the investment in these sub-Saharan, especially sub-Saharan African countries where we've been having funding issues. Because if you look at the electricity sector in Nigeria already, where we are depending on the fossil fuel that we have in abundance, we have not done so well. So is there any likelihood that we are going to be excelling in technologies that would be required to achieve the transition? And again, if you are discussing this, please, if you put that into context, in the context of the recent announcement by the Nigerian government with respect to meeting the global climate targets. Do we have the financial muscle to achieve that? That's one. And then the second thing I want to ask again is transition from oil. Transition from oil, it's a good thing. But there are some technologies, some uses that oil could be put into that is not necessarily for transportation sector and electricity generation. For instance, petrochemicals that are used for drugs production and then tarring of roads and the rest of that. Would there be alternative to all those petrochemical products in the quest for achieving energy transition? Would there be alternatives? Just thinking.
Thank you very much, Israel. And you mentioned two very important points here. First, on the investment, I think also in the recent COP, it was a big discussion how to finance energy transitions also in emerging market development and developing economies. The decision which was taken there was this 100 billion euros investment per year, which are to be reached by 2025 from developed economies. But our analysis showed that these 100 billion per year are clearly not enough. So there more action has to be taken from development banks, governments. More efforts have to be taken to, for example, make existing technologies more attractive in sub-Saharan Africa. We often see that, for example, financing conditions are very difficult. So that is one topic to push here. The investments are increasing, but clearly they are not enough yet for a sustainable transition. To your second question, the oil demand, that is also true. we, even in our net zero emission pathway, we do not go to an oil demand of zero, because as you correctly said, in petrochemical industry, we need oil for feedstock. What we anticipate for this remaining demand is especially carbon capture and storage. So the emissions and also process emissions occurring in chemical processes are captured in our net zero emission scenario.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you very much for all your questions. As you may have seen, we have sent a number of links in the chat. If you want to check more of the publications we mentioned, and I'm just adding one last on finance, because we have a team looking specifically at investment trends in emerging economies, including Africa, and the type of sources, the instruments, the measures which are required to scale up investment. So that could be also an interesting book to look at. Thank you very much to Martin, who joined us for that. Thank you, Zakia. Thank you, everyone, and talk to you in the next IEA Africa University.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.